This conference will now be recorded.
Alrighty. Sorry about the delay, everybody. I got the time mixed up for some reason for when the presentation was to start. But good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Scott Bjorklund, and I'm a park ranger with the Army Corps of Engineers. And I work at the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth, Minnesota. And today, as Sarah said, we'll be doing the Harbor Happenings presentation, how coronavirus has affected Great Lakes shipping. And this is the second virtual presentation that we're doing, so we'll be doing more in the weeks to come. This program is hosted by both the Sioux Locks Visitor Center Association and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and the Lake Superior Maritime or Marine Museum Association here in Duluth. So a little bit before we begin, as you could hear, we are recording the program here. No need to worry though, we will be just doing that so it can be posted later. If you can actually ask questions during the presentation, please feel free. You can type in the chat, and then at the very end, I'll be able to answer those questions for you. Another thing is this will be focused on Duluth-Superior / the western side of Lake Superior. So I'm not familiar with how shipping is being affected at the moment at other parts of the Great Lakes, but this is kind of my main expertise here in Duluth-Superior. And this presentation will be focused on shipping. We'll be really answering any questions if you have any about water levels or the construction of alternate care facilities that the Corps is looking into. We might be doing a presentation later on water levels at some point, but not today. Outline of the presentation, we're going to quickly go over a little bit of overview of the Duluth-Superior Harbor. We will then kind of go through how supply and demand works with the steel industry, kind of how taconite pellets go from the mines all the way to the steel mills and the consumers, and then how that's all affected by demand. The 2020 shipping season so far in Duluth-Superior, the coronavirus effects have been occurring in the last few months. And then in this kind of the second half, later part of the presentation, I'll be looking how this compares to years previous, so other shipping seasons. And then finally, at the very end, what we do, despite all kind of the bad news with what's going on right now, there is some good news in the midst of it, so that'll be at the very end. Quick overview of the harbor here. Duluth-Superior, if you don't already know, is all the way on the western side of Lake Superior. And we are actually the busiest port here on the Great Lakes. We were the 30th busiest port as of last year in the entire country. Main outbound cargoes we have, it's mostly iron ore pellets with a little bit less coal and grain. And we also get a lot of cargoes inbound. But most of what we do is shipping cargoes outbound to ports on either around Lake Superior or more often on the lower lakes. So what did happen last year? We had a pretty good, successful season last year. It was pretty busy. We had about 700 or so ships coming in and out, both Lakers and Salties. Iron ore pellets, we had about 19 million tons to give you kind of an example of what busy would mean. It's a lot of cargo. And we also had a record last year for wind turbine parts. Oh, excuse me. All right. So a little bit on the supply and demand of the industry. In case you weren't already aware, this is kind of how the whole process goes. We'll be focusing on taconite pellets for the most part because since that's the main biggest cargo we ship out of here across the Great Lakes, it has the most effect on what happens here in our port. So it begins with mining taconite rock on the Minnesota Iron Range. In northern Minnesota and in northern Michigan. And then that is turned into iron ore pellets at various facilities on the Iron Range, which is then shipped via rail and then to be loaded on the ships here in our port as well as other ports near here and Marquette, Michigan in the UP. Then those pellets are shipped to the various steel mills located on the lower lakes. Most of those steel mills are located on lower Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. A lot of the U.S. Steel mills are located there, and then there's a few Canadian steel mills, one near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and then there's some more at Hamilton, Ontario, as well as the facility on Lake Erie called Nanticoke, the Lake Erie facility there. And the steel mills, of course, turn the iron ore pellets into steel, which is then sold to consumers. So the biggest consumer of steel today, and it has been for decades, is the auto industry. So the auto industry has a huge effect on this whole supply chain of how all this goes. Now I'll turn on my laser pointer here. And of course, there are other consumers for steel as well, like the construction industry. The gas and oil industry needs lots of steel for their operations. And like I say, the demand here has a huge effect and kind of goes, if there's any negative effects from this, which we'll be talking about today, where there's less demand, it goes all the way up the chain, back up to the iron mines here in the Lake Superior region. So what's been happening so far this season? How has the shipping season compared so far to 2019? And what can we generally say about why things are happening? So so far, I only have totals for the number of ships that have been coming in and out. I don't have tonnages officially. Usually get those from the Duluth Port Authority, but as everyone's dealing with the current situation, I'm sure they'll catch up and be able to post those numbers at some point. But so far, there hasn't been a huge difference in shiploads of iron ore pellets. And one of the main reasons why I'll talk about a little bit is shipping there's usually a delay to how things are affected. So although we're seeing issues with the steel industry slowing down due to demand, we haven't seen a whole lot of effect from that yet. But coal, there's a huge difference. 0 shiploads of coal so far this season compared to 17 last year as of between the start to April. And then we've actually had more shiploads of grain, a lot more, all going overseas, and then more limestone, which again I'll talk about here in the upcoming slides. All right, so what happens when demand decreases, what we're going through right now? Generally, and this has been true for the last 100 years or so, the steel industry kind of ebbs and flows in response to what's going on. So the way they respond to it first, let's say, there's a huge decrease in demand. Typically, steel mills will temporarily shut down blast furnaces individually, the huge pieces of I shouldn't call them equipment. They're big structures that are used to melt down the iron ore pellets to make steel. They'll usually shut those down one at a time, and then of course they'll lay off steel workers as a result, depending on how severe the downturn is. So to show you kind of what's been going on in the last few months, I'm going to be using U.S. Steel as a good example here. Everything seemed pretty okay up until mid-March. Not a whole lot has happened yet due to the coronavirus effects from the markets, but starting March 18th, mid-March, that's when it was first reported that a lot of automakers here in the U.S. and around the world were going to be shutting down temporarily due to market conditions and due to COVID. They wanted to clean up the facilities, make it safer for workers. And at that time, the nation was at about 80% steel mill utilization, which means that 80% of the steel mills and their blast furnaces were operating, which is actually pretty healthy. That's a good percentage to be at for productivity, and that's kind of commonly used as a measure of how good things are going or how bad. So by late March, U.S. Steel kind of responds to everything that's going on with the markets. They first announced that they're going to start plant layoffs that focus on creating products for the gas and oil industry, which, as we all know right now, gas prices are really low. as a result, U.S. Steel decided to those facilities have been pretty much shut down, and they also announced that their first blast furnace was going to be idled, like other steel mills were responding at the time. And then by late April, which is more recent, U.S. Steel has idled 5 of their 8 blast furnaces, so most of their blast furnaces have been temporarily shut down. And nationally, there's been about 50% steel mill utilization. So there's a huge drop from mid-March to late April there. So when the steel mills first respond, that kind of goes up the chain all the way up to the mines. How do they respond to this? Typically, the taconite mines simply either shut down or reduce production and lay off miners, and that's how U.S. Steel has pretty much responded so far. Overall, 3 of the 6 operational U.S. Taconite mines here in the Lake Superior region, only 3 of the 6 are operational right now, and they may open again this summer, either in June or July, has been commonly reported. U.S. Steel specifically, late April, they announced that they were going to idle their Keetac mine, which is one of 2 mines that they have operating. And then on May 1st, interestingly, they actually offered a Canadian steel company, Stelco, 25% ownership of Mintac, their largest and the largest taconite mine here on the Iron Range. And the reason for that is so that they could actually possibly get some money back due to the losses that they're going to incur this year. All right, so now that the steel mills responded along with the mines, finally we have shipping that's affected through both of those. So this is what's happened so far this season. The shipping companies responded that they were going to do everything they could to make things safe for mariners. And mariners were considered essential early on, so they did start operating as usual right around the end of March. Some of the main things the shipping companies decided to do was crews were not given shore leave. So this is so that they can't accidentally run into someone that might have coronavirus. So they're kept on the ships, which is really rough. They typically get the ability to get off if they're not working. So they're unfortunately have to stay on their ships for a lot longer, months at a time. Crew members are being pre-screened before boarding, so like taking temperature, making sure kind of what area they came for so they can kind of see if anyone's sick to try and keep those people from getting on board. And then general social distancing like we've all been doing. These 2 pictures on the side here are the James R. Barker. Obviously, there's a lot of deck space that they can kind of keep. There's certain situations where they can't keep separated, like in the engine room and other crowded compartments, but shipping companies have been making sure there's less people kind of clustered together. And then here in their cafeteria, Great Lakes ships right now have social distancing in those cafeteria spaces. On a side note too, with ocean-going vessels, it was announced that they are allowed to dock in our harbor or any of the harbors in the Great Lakes as long as they don't have any sick on board. So far, there haven't been really any coronavirus cases that have been reported on the Great Lakes ships. There may have been a few unreported, but so far nothing major, so that's awesome. The crews are staying safe as of right now. Another effect with the coronavirus on the shipping here is the ships have been laying up all across the Great Lakes. That's a typical response with all that's going on. When you have lower demand, there's less ships that are needed, so a lot of ships are temporarily put to the dock to wait out what's going on. So currently, as of today, there might have been another ship that laid up that I wasn't aware of, but 9 American and 6 Canadian Lakers around the Great Lakes are currently laid up at ports all over the place, from Sturgeon Bay to here in Duluth-Superior, and on the Canadian side as well at Owen Sound, Hamilton, lots of different places. All these ships, 8 of them actually never left winter layup. A lot of the shipping companies kind of anticipated what was going to happen, so they kept a bunch of their ships from moving. And then in the last month or so, there have been 7 that have returned to layup. So they actually started the season, and then they ended up being temporarily put back to the dock. Interesting to note, of those 15 total laid up, 3 are 1,000 footers, which is kind of a big deal. The 1,000-footers are pretty much looked at as the most efficient ships on the lake, so they're usually thought to be the ones for sure operating, but due to what's going on right now, 3 of them have been laid up out of that 15. And to give you a sense of what is normal, there's actually only 35 American freighters operating when out of 44 normally. A little bit on the ships laid up here in Duluth-Superior specifically. We have some awesome photos here taken by Gus Schauer. He's one of the awesome drone photographers here in the port. And he and his dad, David Schauer, have been great at documenting what's been happening so far. Two of the 3 ships we currently have in Duluth, the Alpina here on the left, has been here since late April due to low cement demand, so they're here. And then the James R. Barker is currently at Midwest Energy on the Superior side, again, due to low demand. Then the last ship that's here in the port of the 3 is the Lee Tregurtha. They were the latest laid up end of April. And they're currently sitting at Fraser Shipyards, which this picture depicts from a winter layup a year or 2 ago. So when we were comparing what's going on right now, why is there no coal and why is there more shipments of limestone so far? Well, coal right now, generally coal has been actually going down for our port in the last few years. Power plants if they haven't already, they're converting to natural gas. A lot of the coal that is shipped out of the Twin Ports actually goes to those power plants. It's low sulfur variety from out west that they use for that. So we were already anticipating there's going to be less coal this season, but it's very strange that we haven't had any shipments so far. Another reason is because the dock has been pretty much shut down due to both coronavirus and the market is the other reason why we haven't seen anything happen there. It's kind of unknown right now when they'll restart. They did have shipments scheduled in April before they shut things down, so I suspect they will ship at some point this season, but as not quite yet. So we'll have to see. Maybe it'll be later this summer. Who knows? There are a few power plants that still need coal. I'm sure they have enough at the moment. If not, they're using trains to get that there. Then limestone. Why have we had more limestone so far compared to last season? Well, construction has been still considered essential. Limestone is used in the iron ore industry, but is also used in the construction industry. So, and I suspect another reason we've just had a lot of limestone coming in is because due to low steel demand, the shipping companies are trying to ship as much as they can. So limestone has been something good for the smaller ships that are operating on the Great Lakes to keep business going. So how does this all compare to past events in history? What I kind of wanted to do here is I'll kind of compare our season so far, kind of how it echoes history and how it's different, both with a little bit on the Spanish flu epidemic as well as other downturns in the steel industry overall. And here we have a photo of the famous Edward L. Ryerson, which was laid up during the Great Recession due to what was going on then, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So history repeats itself. There's been a lot of talk from historians, especially on comparing the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic rather to the Spanish flu in 1918. That was a famously deadly outbreak of disease right at the end of World War I, which pretty much impacted millions across the planet. In fact, I went back and looked at some old Lake Carriers Association annual reports, and that's a major organization and has been for shipping here on the American side of the lakes for many years. They did report that there was an effect. There were actually 25 mariners who unfortunately died due to the virus or the Spanish flu in the fall of 1918 when the flu was at its worst, at least here in the United States. That's pretty incredible, though, that only a few were actually killed by it because it had a major deadly impact across the entire country at the time. So it just showed how the measures they took were actually pretty successful. They actually took really similar measures at the time to keep crew members from getting sick. Today, like they did it then, they quarantined crew members and removed any sick crew members from the ships if there were any outbreaks. So as the Lake Carriers Association kind of stated, the ships were pretty, because of the open air environment, they were pretty, they did pretty well. Now, the economic effect of Spanish flu was a lot different compared to what we're going through today. Because it was at the end of World War One, factories, everything was producing at 100% for the Allied effort. So there weren't factories that were shut down for this. They all kept producing. So markets for steel and shipping were minimally affected by the Spanish flu at the time. And the photo here on the right, quick. Here in Duluth-Superior, anyway, we were actually having a lot of ships being built for the Allied cause, and as an example of what was going on here in 1918. And this is a particular ship that was built in Superior, on the Superior side, and during that year, called the Lake Dimer, that was sent overseas. All right, besides the Spanish flu, then we'll move on to comparing 2020 so far to other downturn seasons. The shipping industry has gone through downturns time and again, and our port has been affected by it, but that's just the way things are, and it's always recovered. So things will keep going, no matter how bad 2020 is. We're going to see downturns again and again, and we'll have good years. But the Great Depression is probably one of the more famous examples on the Great Lakes for probably the worst shipping season ever experienced out of the 100 plus years of shipping, especially here in Duluth-Superior, 150 years. Began with the stock market crash, of course, as everyone knows, in October 1929. But the effects from that stock market crash were pretty slow to begin with. The shipping seasons of 1930 and 1931, you could tell that there were issues with steel demand, but the effects weren't really severely felt until 1932, a few years later. And that was probably the worst shipping season during the Great Depression during the 1930s. So if you remember earlier, I talked about how national steel utilization as of right now is about 50%. Well, in 1932, it was at an all-time low of 19%. Most of the steel mills were pretty much shut down. The iron mines were shutting down to near nil operation-wise. So as a result, shipping was very low. And I like to use U.S. Steel as a good example because traditionally they had the largest fleet for many years, the Pittsburgh steamship fleet to be exact. To show how severe 1932 was, there were only 9 of their 86 steamers were actually operating during the shipping season, only between July and November, half the year. Most of the Great Lakes vessels that year were laid up all across the Great Lakes. Very few operated, so a lot of mariners were laid off. Only the officers and engineers, the higher ups of the ships, were actually allowed to, because of hierarchy, were allowed to sail that year. Despite the huge downturn, there was coal that kept some companies going during the time. There's always that one cargo that kind of keeps things going, but overall things were really low. In the Twin Ports alone, we only shipped 2 million tons of iron ore that year. That is incredibly small compared to 1929, when we shipped about 44 million tons, which is, a really good year for the Twin Ports at the time. Comparing it to 2020, 1932 was far worse, and it's hard to compare for several reasons. One is we have an entirely different iron ore industry as they did at the time. We also have tons more, they had tons more ships back then, but our ships are a lot bigger and economical today. So the fleets were entirely different. So hard to compare. This 1932 was exceptional in terms of how bad things were. The ship depicted in the photo here, that is the Eugene P. Thomas, built in 1930. It was actually one of the last ships built for the Pittsburgh steamship fleet in 1930. It's kind of representative of how very little ships were built during the Great Depression. That was one of the last ships built before things went on a huge downturn. more ships weren't really built until later on in the 30s. So, all right, fast forward a little bit from the Great Depression. Now we have the 1980s steel crisis. I'm sure there are a few of you that remembered what happened during those years. It was pretty bad recession here in the United States, and particularly for the U.S. steel industry. What caused it? There had been a lot of different causes to it, and it was all in the decades kind of leading up to the 1980s. Primarily, it was caused by a lot of foreign steel imports. Those had been increasing throughout the years because foreign steel had becoming cheaper and cheaper. Here in the U.S., a lot of our steel mills were aging, the equipment, so steel was actually more, as the steel mills aged and they weren't being updated, steel was becoming more expensive. And then other world events also caused it, such as the oil crisis in the 1970s. But 1982 was one of the worst seasons during that time, so I'll use that kind of as an example. National steel utilization was at 30% by the end of 1982, so it was pretty rough. Not quite as bad as the season we just talked about in the Great Depression, but worse than what we're seeing right now. Again, using the Pittsburgh fleet as an example of what happened during the 80s. At the beginning of the decade, they had about 32 ships, but by 1988, they only had 13 ships. So during the 80s, it's famously known that a lot of ships were scrapped, not just because of their age, but due to the low steel demand. So a lot of ships were scrapped at the time, and a lot were scrapped by U.S. Steel in particular. During the time, a lot of steel mills went bankrupt and shut down. Thousands of jobs were lost in the Iron Range and shipping in the steel industry, of course. But what's kind of interesting to say is that the 1980s steel crisis is kind of what made the steel industry is today. Because of this crisis, the steel industry today was actually able to respond to economic conditions a lot quicker because there's a lot less steel mills running. So comparing it to 2020, so far it's been kind of similar, but it's still different in a lot of ways. Many ships were scrapped during the 80s, which is the reason why we have so few ships today. But there were a lot of older ships at the time, so a lot of them were scrapped for old age besides demand. So again, there's those differences in the fleet that runs shipping today. And like I said, the steel industry can more easily respond due to economic conditions at the time. In the 1980s, there were too many steel mills and steel companies in the country. That's why a whole ton of them went bankrupt and ended operations due to what was going on. Photo quick on the right, that's the Roger Blau arriving through the area lift bridge in Duluth. The Roger Blau famously didn't operate for most of the 80s. Part of the reasons being that the Roger Blau was not quite a 1,000-footer, but not quite one of the smaller ships. So the 1,000-footers were usually operating in the 80s, shipping iron ore pellets, and then the smaller ships were running other cargoes. So the Roger Blau was laid up for many years during the 80s due to what was going on. Then finally, the most recent, and I'm sure a lot of you remember the Great Recession 2007 to 2008 and the effects of it thereafter. I would say this is the most similar to what we're experiencing right now. I'm not going to go into the causes of the Great Recession because they're too complicated to discuss at this moment. There's still being studies even figuring out what exactly happened. But importantly for the shipping industry, the steel industry didn't feel the effects of it until October of 2008. That's kind of when things went downhill really quickly in terms of the steel markets around the world and in the U.S. As a result, that fall, a lot of ships went into early winter layup, especially a lot of the older, smaller ships like the American Victory and the Edward L. Ryerson on the right. National steel utilization by the spring of the next year in 2009 was pretty low at 40%. Now we're currently at 50%, which is there's not a whole lot of difference between 2009 so far has been a lot worse, or at least worse than what we're experiencing now. By the middle of 2009, there was only about 49 ships operating, with several U.S. ships still in layup compared to 75 the previous year, to kind of show how bad things were. And then there were 7 ships that never left layup all season during 2009. So things were pretty bad. Two of those ships, again, on the right, the American Victory and the Edward L. Ryerson, they both famously laid up here in the Twin Ports permanently. The Victory in 2008 and the Ryerson in 2009. The Victory was actually just towed out of here for scrapping in 2018. And then the Edward L. Ryerson still sits in Superior as a reminder of what happened during the Great Recession. There are still a few boats laid up ports since the Great Depression. Only 21 million tons were shipped that year. So again, so far it's been pretty similar, but it hasn't so far been as bad as 2009. So we'll have to wait out and see what the rest of the season brings. So out of all the bad news, been talking through the presentation today, here's some kind of good news, polar opposite of what was going on. So the seal industry has been in a downturn, but grain demand has been huge so far this season, particularly due to the coronavirus pandemic. Countries like Italy and others in Europe, there's a high demand for grain. So as a result, we've had a lot of ships visiting Thunder Bay. Huge amounts of ocean-going vessels compared to previous years have been going there to load grain for those countries. And then here in the Twin Ports, we've even seen the effects. We've had 8 salties so far to the end of April. That's a pretty significant increase compared to the 2 that visited in the same period in 2019. So we're actually seeing that demand here in the port. And then, of course, once again, overall reminder that although things are rough right now with shipping and the seal industry, it's happened before. So I'm sure, things will keep going. Things keep producing. Things will rebound. That's just how the seal industry goes. So, all right. So that kind of concludes the presentation for today. Just so as a reminder, we have another presentation a week from now. One of our other rangers, Steve, will be looking at the process of how Lake Superior was formed. So if you're super into geology, or if you just have an interest in it, I definitely suggest tuning in at the same time. I'm sure he'll start at the correct time rather than me being late. And thanks for joining, and I guess we can take some questions if anyone has any about what we talked about. We can give you a moment too if it's taking a bit. Have there been any questions, Sarah, in the chat?
Nope, I haven't seen any yet. Wait, we've got.
All right.
How long have you been following Great Lakes shipping?
Let's see. So I started at the Visitor Center in 2017. So I really didn't get interested in all this until I started working at the Visitor Center. And then 2018 is when I started taking a lot more photos of ships coming in. So I've been super into it since then. But I'm interested to see what happens this season in terms of, since I wasn't around during the recession in 2009, I forgot to mention kind of as a prediction, we might see some more ships lay up. We actually are going to see a few more lay up in the near future. So, but I'm guessing things will rebound maybe the second half of the year, depending on what happens. But either way, I think things might improve by the end of the year in terms of the steel industry and shipping. But we'll have to see. It's kind of interesting to watch to see how things respond, how the whole system kind of responds to from shipping to the mines. So we'll have to see.
Great. There's another question about visitor centers opening up again, and I can address that. This is Sarah from the Lake-Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth. Both our visitor center and the Sulaks Visitor Center have re-entry plans that are kind of phased plans. So it involves opening up some of our for the zoo, it involves opening up some of their park spaces before the visitor centers. Because we're in two different states, there's not a really good rule that'll cover both of us, since the situation is changing so differently in each of our states. So what the Lake-Superior Maritime Visitor Center is planning is a phased reopening. So we'll initially bring the staff back to work at the office, and then we'll continue doing virtual presentations like this and improving our the information that we have outside in our parks for visitors. And we might end up putting park rangers at a booth outside to answer questions before we open the visitor center up. And then we also eventually might open up with restricted hours, and we don't really have a way to restrict visitors at this point. So it's going to be a slower process, and it's not going to be something that we're going to, reopen one day just out of the blue. We'll be keeping you guys informed on our progress and continuing to update you on what we're doing. There's another question about accessing the recorded presentations, and those are going to be available on our various social media platforms. The Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District Facebook page, along with the Sulaks Visitor Center Association page and the Lake-Superior Marine Museum Association page. So those will be available on social media. But if you can't find them, just let us know and we can send those to you. We've got a couple, and I'd like to invite you guys, if you have ideas about other topics and things like that you'd like to see us do, you can put those in the chat as well. We'll make note of those and see if we can get something put together for those. And I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for your patience as we work through this new technology to be able to bring you these virtual programs. We'll keep this open for a couple more minutes in case there are any more questions. Otherwise, the information on the page that you see talks a little bit about what's going to happen next week and some contact information for both the Lake-Superior Maritime Visitor Center and the Sulaks. I don't think the Sulaks is on there, but we'll put them on next time.